getting better? Hello, Linda. Can you hear me in the back row? All right. Are we close enough? Okay, thank you for that. And what is our time frame, Ted?
As long as you want until you're done.
Okay, let me ask you, what is our time frame? What, 8 o'clock? All right, that's great. I think we've got plenty of time. So I will talk for a little while and put enough material out there to get us to fruitful questions, and then I have some backup information in case your questions take us in a different direction, which you are welcome to do. I'm delighted to be here tonight, and I'm always happy to see the interest in the important work that is and needs to get done every day in the Boston Public Schools, and that in particular is my mandate as interim superintendent appointed in July 2018. While the city and community searches for a long-term leader, our children do not have a year to mark time. Our district doesn't have a year to mark time. It's absolutely vital that we keep work moving forward and solve some problems, hopefully, which will set up the long-term leadership of the district, hopefully in a better place. So that is my mandate. That's what I was asked to do, and it's, while unexpected, as Ted may have mentioned, work that has been my passion. Working in and around the Boston Public Schools is the focus of my organization's prior improvement efforts. I had been president and CEO of Edvestors, which is an education nonprofit that, as Ted said, worked both with individual schools and also at the systemic level. That is the genesis of my knowledge of the district over the past 16 years. Prior to that, I had a number of interactions with education organizations, also with the Alternative Education Network, where I spent some time working earlier in my career, which I think is very important because my first lens on the public education system was through the prism of the students that the system failed, who then landed up in GED programs and alternative education programs. I've carried that focus and priority with me into this work. I'm also a long-time, now former parent of 2 Boston Public School students who attended BPS from kindergarten through high school graduation. And it has always served me well to understand the district through a parent's lens, as well as that of a school improvement advocate, which is what I consider myself. And now, shall we say, an accidental interim superintendent, but one who is very, very committed to the cause. One of the things I want to just start off by saying is that the work in central office that I've attempted or am attempting to move forward this year is an interconnected one with our frontline school communities, our teachers, school leaders, and staff who touch the lives of our students every day. It's incredibly important work. They are on the front lines, really working tirelessly in a large and complicated system to provide a high-quality education for students of an extraordinary range of both needs, assets, and aspirations. And I always want to include assets and inspirations. We do talk a lot about student need. We will talk a lot about student need, but in understanding how to move students forward and how to provide them with opportunities while closing opportunity gaps, we need to also remember that our children, all of our children, bring assets and aspirations, as do their families, into the public education system. And so it's critical that we pay attention to that while we also pay attention to addressing needs. And while there is always, and I'm particularly interested tonight in talking about some of these complicated issues which are intertwined with race, class, trauma, and poverty. And so while there is also always need for improvement, and we'll talk a lot about that tonight, it's also true that a lot has changed for the better in the Boston Public Schools over the past few decades. We have an all-time high graduation rate. just shy of 73% in 2017. We have a strong commitment to ensuring safe, welcoming, and inclusive schools for all students. I realize I'm not doing anything on the slides. But I think we're in a good place if you want to click through to the next slide. And one of the things that is true about BPS today, as I work in central office, is that the lens of equity is deeply embedded in the decision-making and processes of the district. We have a long way to go, but I am pleased to say as a longtime observer that questions of equity and how they are employed in decision-making is more visible inside the district, and I'll talk about how we do that and the tools that we use to deliberately embed that lens into our work. And when I talk about equity-based decisions, I'm talking about a wide range of decisions, from how we determine and develop academic programming to which schools and where we prioritize delivery of healthier school meals, how we provide transportation, our hiring practices, and perhaps most importantly, how we form our budget, because a budget is a statement of values. And so I'll touch on that just a little bit, and all of these decisions have extraordinarily real impacts on our 55,000 students. So I want to start out just by some framing information. In the Boston Public Schools, we educate 86% students of color. The Latinx students are now our largest population within the Boston Public Schools, surpassing all other race and culture demographics. For 45% of our students, English is not their first language. Our students speak more than 72 languages at home and in our classrooms. And about 21% of our students have special needs that range from mild to significant. Among our students for whom English is not their first language, about 30% of them are active English learners, which means they are at relatively rudimentary levels of acquiring academic language to access learning in our schools. One of the themes in Boston Public Schools over the past couple of years that I think is incredibly important is a concerted focus to develop instruction that is culturally and linguistically relevant. And that we are working toward closing opportunity and achievement gaps. Specifically, one of the instructional priorities are to embed culturally and linguistically sustaining practices in our instruction, and a vision for instructional equity that drives our professional learning and our work in schools. Let me talk a little bit about some of the programmatic strategies for closing opportunity and achievement gaps and addressing equity. One of them is a program that started, it's now in its third year, it's called Excellence for All, and we're on the right slide. So for those of you who are familiar with the history of the Boston Public Schools, there are all kinds of embedded programs and pathways for students. One of them, of course, is the priority that historically Boston has placed on its selective entrance exam schools. So these are three of our high schools, the best known Boston Latin School, Boston Latin Academy, and the O'Brien School for Math and Science. These are schools that, for whom you have to pass a selective admissions exam, as well as meet grade levels or your GPA. And it has, for many years, been viewed as the pinnacle of educational opportunities for our students. In the 70s and 80s, coming out of busing with those exam schools, we developed something called Advanced Work Class, which, not to put too fine a point on it, is basically a tracking system that selects initially students in fall of their third grade. I don't know about you, but I'm not sure I was shining in the fall of my third grade. And so a standardized test in the fall of third grade determines how the system historically begins sorting kids and putting them into a homogeneous educational environment, which is what advanced work class is. This was part, and I'm sure Ted, who knows this history as well and better than I do, in some of these early stages, was clearly a way of ensuring, not to put too fine a point on it, middle-class white families, that they would have a accelerated pathway into the exam schools. It has been thus fiercely guarded and protected over the years. One of the things that I thought was particularly strong under Dr. Chang's leadership in the previous administration was that they began developing a parallel program that would broaden opportunities. So they didn't try right away to shut down advanced work class. They began a parallel alternative, often a good change strategy. It is called Excellence for All. It takes a heterogeneous approach to enriching academic instruction in grades 4 through 6, meaning that it does not select and sort students, but rather takes a whole classroom, whole school approach. We began rolling it out 3 years ago. It's now in 16 schools in grades 4 through 6, and it provides some of the same enrichments that were segregated in advanced work class, but it does it across an entire classroom. It thus broadens opportunities for students and families where you had to leave your school to go to a school that had the advanced work class program. Now, by adding 16 more schools, we minimize the jumping and swapping of schools, which is a whole different story of how difficult that is to manage in terms of enrollment and feeder pathways and equity, quite frankly. But it is a parallel program. We are still evaluating and assessing its impact, but it has absolutely broadened opportunity for students. So that, I think, is one way that is at least important to do experimenting. It's also pushing at teacher expectations for who can access more advanced and rigorous work. Also an incredibly important part of this puzzle. The second wave is something that we accelerated just this year after my arrival. But if we're talking about advanced work class, then the next topic is the exam schools themselves. They educate 25% of our high school students, but it basically sets up a multi-tier system inside of BPS. That said, there are certain citadels that are harder to pull down than others, but you can begin infusing from the bottom up. So one of the ways that we are approaching exam school diversity in an era where we no longer are able to use, as Boston did earlier, through the early 90s, mid-90s, when even the exam schools had race-based admissions quotas. Those are gone due to, federal concerns about court cases and admissions. And as a result, into the 2000s, the diversity of the exam schools began diminishing significantly, particularly Boston Latin School. So one of the things that, again, began a couple of years ago in the district, and we are accelerating it, is efforts to increase access to the exam school admissions by offering to a broader range of students the kinds of opportunities that many parents were accessing in the form of private tutoring for their students, which again is another way that we set up inequities or allow inequities to happen across our system. So for the last few years, the Boston Public Schools has been strengthening a program called the Exam School Initiative. One of the ways they started doing that is developing tutoring programs that would be delivered after school and summer to a broader range of students. We got even more refined than that and began identifying students whose MCAS scores showed that they were prepared for rigor, that represented students from historically marginalized populations, and then drawing them into the Exam School Initiative for boot camps, for tutoring, for expedited registration, so that they could get to the exam, which takes place on a random Saturday in November. So when we talk about social capital, that's also an issue for families who their parents have been talking to them for months about getting to the exam versus kids that may be trying to get there on their own, families who are unfamiliar with the process. So we were pre-registering kids. We were getting buses to take them to the exam. That was happening for the past 2 years. And this year we announced that next year we will be delivering the entrance exam for the exam schools during the school day in every 6th grade classroom, so that it is evenly available to all students. So I announced this last fall. We have just embedded it into our budget, which means that it will be real, and we are actively planning for that to happen in fall of 2019. Again, these are steps forward and inroads. We are also looking at the test itself, but this was a really, I think for Boston, a bold and important step that we knew we could take now. And so we did. So a long way to go on the topic of exam school, diversity and equity of access, but I think an important step forward. Let me see, why don't we go forward we just jumped right over the exam schools. Let's go to the opportunity gap slide. Another developing trend in Boston over the past couple of years is the establishment of an Office of Opportunity Gaps, which corresponds with the Opportunity and Achievement Gap Task Force and the Opportunity and Achievement Gap Policy and Implementation Plan. I would say the policy is quite lofty, the implementation plan is quite complicated, but it is increasingly deeply owned in how the district does its work. And it's not just policy that happens in the Office of Opportunity Gaps, but they are also developing, testing, piloting, and modeling multiple strategies to expand opportunities and assist schools in closing opportunity gaps for our students. One of the ways that, so they're basically embedded change agents inside of central office would be, I think, a really good way of describing them. Their job is to develop and model strategies to get students from, again, traditionally marginalized populations, engaged and excited about their learning, and identify strategies to remove barriers for these students. One of them, in addition to the exam school work, so they are key players in the exam school initiative, as is our equity office, but the Opportunity Gaps office also focuses on things like developing mentorship and leadership programs for boys of color. The 10 Boys initiative, which now also has a corollary 10 Girls initiative, would be one of these examples. These are school-based groups that seek to develop adult relationships with students and encourage them and incentivize them into more engaged learning. Things like planning overseas trips for these students to places like Ghana, identifying curriculum adjustments that affirm students' identities. For example, in 2017, they worked with the history department to adopt the Peters projection maps in our schools, which provide a more accurate and less Eurocentric geographical depiction of our planet. These are small and big ways that they work to remove barriers to learning and enhance engagement for all of our students. The Office of Equity is also an incredibly important tool inside central office. The Office of Equity plays an active role in acting against bias-based conduct and sexual misconduct. This also includes pro-social outreach and prevention, like our brand new 24/7 Respect Week that we that's on staff, we'll get to that in a minute, but our 24/7 Respect Week, the first of which we launched on Monday with a learning video and curriculum guide that will be broadcast in all of our grades 6 to 12 classrooms. What I like about it is that it was co-developed with youth leaders and our equity office. The narrators, script writers, and editors were some of our youth leaders, and the focus on this was internet safety, and anti-bullying prevention in an online environment. It also obviously corresponds to what happens in our classrooms and hallways, but again, focused on educating our students about their rights and responsibilities when encountering bias-based language or sexual misconduct online. It is a scary world out there for our young students in an online environment. It's scary for all of us as adults who know what they encounter and the kinds of behaviors that we might see, threatening behaviors that we might see in classroom hallways, locker rooms, or playgrounds now take place over handhelds. So it is incumbent on the Boston Public Schools to equip, educate, and protect our students in whatever environment they find themselves. Since we're on the staff slide, I would say that another key and ongoing priority for the Boston Public Schools is about our highly targeted effort to attract effective teachers of color to work in the Boston Public Schools and to figure out pipelines and pathways that move beyond traditional teacher prep programs. And I realize I say this in an institution of higher learning, but it may not come as a big surprise for an urban district seeking to recruit educators of color that traditional teacher preparation programs are not strong resources for us in this regard. We need them to be better and stronger allies in this work, but over the past 3 years, the Boston Public Schools has gone ahead and developed 5 of its own teacher preparation pipeline programs. Because it is so critical that we increase the supply of teachers coming into our system, because particularly among our teachers of color, many of them entered the profession in the 70s and 80s. They are retiring at very high rates at this point, and so we need to fill the pipeline from the other end at an accelerated rate, even as we are increasing our efforts to retain educators of color, because we are losing them through the natural aging and retirement process on the back end, and the math is not working in our favor right now. So what that means is as fast as we are developing and inducting and retaining, we are losing on the back end. That said, 50% of all teachers of color in Massachusetts work in the Boston Public Schools. We have the largest number of teachers of color over any other district by far, but it's absolutely not enough because we are, of course, also the largest district. The reason that this is a priority goes far beyond the Garrity Order, or actually the Morgan Order, which is its official name, but that we know from our own focus on culturally, linguistically, and sustaining practices that when students see their identities and cultures reflected in trusted adults in front of them, they are more engaged in their learning. It creates a safer learning environment for them. So it is not just a compliance focus, it is also an academic, an aspirational, and an equity focus that prioritizes the recruitment and retention of more teachers of color. What we've found over the years, so our Office of Human Capital has really strengthened its data analysis. We understand where our teachers are coming from. We understand what the challenges are to retaining them. One of the things that the data has shown is that out-of-state recruitment for new teachers of color produce marginal results. So at various points, people wanted us to be everywhere nationally, recruiting every teacher of color. We attempted to do that, and what we find is that most new teachers take jobs in their home states, so that, which is one of those facts that you have to adjust your strategy. It's one of the reasons that we lean toward developing multiple pipeline programs based in Boston and based in community. One of them is a new teacher pipeline program in collaboration with the City Year and UMass Boston's Teach Next Year residency program that is brand new. We have a BPS teaching fellowship that fast tracks developing teachers focused on special education and ESL with a six-week summer training program and an opportunity to walk into a classroom with mentors in their first year. Two of them that I'm very excited about is that we now have an accelerated community to teacher program where we are identifying caring adults, whether they're working in after-school programs, whether they're in community centers, and cultivating and recruiting them into a training program that initially develops them as paraprofessionals in our schools. We are now in our 4th cohort of this 12-month part-time training program. And then a very exciting one is our own BPS community paraprofessional development program. So we are developing people from the community and getting them into paraprofessional roles. Then we are identifying our existing paraprofessionals and putting them in a training program to become teachers. These are adults who are already in our schools and in our classrooms in more limited roles, and they are one of the easiest pipelines to turn on by providing an easier access point for the education and training that turns them into teachers in our classroom. So those are, I think, particularly exciting. The third strategy, which we have deepened, we piloted last year and have deepened this year, is that our data shows that one of the best recovery and retention points, or rather, one of the places where, one of the leaky parts of the pipeline right now is licensure for our new and provisional teachers of color. So everyone has to pass something called the MTEL exam. We have found that we were losing some of our brand new teachers who struggled with licensure issues. So we added initially a half-time person. We quickly scaled it up to full-time, and we are planning to add a second who exclusively work with our new teachers of color in the licensure process to provide them additional support. If you already have a teacher, a provisional teacher, and you lose them to lack of license, you've lost all of that investment. So in doubling down on licensure, we have found that that is the fastest way to secure long-term teachers of color into the profession. So I'm gonna leave the topic of staff diversity for a moment, but we can certainly return to it. Let's see, you had used the word resilient earlier in our discussion, so let me talk a little bit about the importance of both efforts to build resilience, but also specifically strategies to build trauma-informed practice and instruction in our schools. We know that we must address the needs of students who experience trauma, violence, abuse, struggle with mental health issues, and face the violence of poverty on a daily basis. This impacts nearly all of our schools, but is obviously concentrated in a number of schools. And so one of the key strategies there is to support our educators, the adults in the building, to build their skill base, to connect with students who are experiencing and impacted by trauma. We do that through a number of strategies. One is obviously we lean on partners with expertise from mental health provision to trauma-informed strategies. We are also in many ways pushing hard on embedding trauma-informed models and practices that are now being used in more and more of our schools. I'll point to one in particular. So the Burke High School in Dorchester was one of the lowest performing high schools in the state. It was a level 4 turnaround school. The Department of Elementary and Secondary Education has changed its approach in this past year, but we still have a number of schools that are classified as level 4 turnaround schools. The Burke was one of them. It was also the first high school in the state, in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, to move out of turnaround status. My former organization gives an annual prize of $100,000. It's called the Thomas W. Payzant School on the Move Prize, and it recognizes one of the most rapidly improving schools. The Burke won our prize in the same year that they exited from turnaround status, and they did it by embedding trauma-informed practice in their schools and training all of their teachers in relational strategies to help students develop and access learning in their classrooms while meeting their very specific needs their social emotional learning needs, and their student support needs through trauma-informed practice. The other part of addressing issues of trauma is responding to them on a regular and consistent basis in school and in community. So while we are focusing on sort of entry-level or tier 1 strategies for every student relative to teaching social emotional skills in our classrooms, increasing the number of school psychologists and counselors who are available in our schools, looking at ongoing educational models like the comprehensive behavioral health management approach that is a partnership between UMass, Children's Hospital, and the Boston Public Schools, now functioning in about 70 of our schools. So really embedding structures and practices that allow and equip adults in a building to understand how to tier supports to the level of student need. We also have built up our capacity to respond to issues of trauma when they happen in our school buildings. And so we do this in 2 ways. The Boston Public Schools actually has its own trauma response team. So if anything happens in a school building, a student dies, a teacher dies, there's a fight with a knife in a bathroom, or a racist graffiti is found in a hallway. In any of those settings, we can immediately, with a phone call, get a trauma response team, social workers and counselors who are there to support existing school staff and interface with students. About 2 weeks ago, we had 30 kids on a bus, and a man was shot in front of them. A car was parked in front of them. They were stopped for dropping off a student, and a man was shot in the car in front of them in a hail of gunfire. We immediately had our trauma team and the BPD and our own school police rushing out to the bus so that they could get on that bus, and then the next morning, the trauma team was waiting at the school when that bus pulled up, got up on the school bus with the kids, talked to them about what they had experienced that night. We had information going home in multiple languages to families, giving them some tips on how to address such a disruptive and traumatic and violent experience that their young children might have seen. These are ways that we need to be constantly equipped to respond immediately to the presenting issues, and then embed responsiveness and support in our school buildings. In this trauma work, we also interface with neighborhood-based trauma teams that the city has established across Boston. The mayor just added another trauma team this past week, and so we work closely with them, particularly if it's a large or complicated issue. There is always lots to do in meeting the needs of our students. I want to shift gears a little bit, and I'm not sure how many slides fit this category, but I want to shift gears a little bit to return to this topic of how do we embed, see, where do we land up? Oh, that was the trauma slide. Apparently I'm not on cue here. You can flip through the oh, well, you could just leave it on the photos of very adorable children. The children right behind me right now are eating their meals at in reimagined school cafeterias that are called My Way Cafes. This is an effort to get healthier, more nutritious, choice-based, locally sourced food being prepared in our cafeterias and offered to children. So far, over the course of the last year and a half, it is now in 31 schools. We'll be putting it into another 20 to 25 schools next year, and so forth, until we get to all of our schools. Kids actually go through and get to choose their food. We're finding that kids are eating and throwing away less food, which is extraordinarily important. And I'll explain later how we used our opportunity index and other equity-focused data on student need to actually identify which neighborhoods and in what order we would roll out the My Way Cafe, since we couldn't do them all at once. And this is a consistent practice that we attempt to embed in our work. I want to just take a look and see what order they put these in. So, let me start out by talking about the, well, he's got it in the order of the budget. So let's start by talking about the budget. And let me see where we are. There we go. Okay. So Boston is in the, BPS is in the middle of its budgeting process for FY20. It happens very early in the Boston Public Schools by statute. It's a throwback to the Brahmin era when they did not believe that the Irish in Boston could manage their own budgets. So the state got much more involved in overseeing how and when the school district budget in Boston is approved. By statute, by state statute, it is revealed in the first week of February and voted on in the last week of March. It's a little interesting artifact of our history. That said, we are in the middle of that process right now. And one of the, we have over the years embedded a number of different equity tools into our annual budgeting process. So our priorities in funding schools are equity, transparency, stability, and school flexibility. Boston is a school system that values autonomy. We have about 42% of our schools that operate on some level of autonomy. They are pilot schools, they are innovation schools, they are Horace Mann or in-district charters, and in addition, all of our schools function on what's known as site-based management. So while the central office provides the largest portion of a school's budget based on enrollment, the number of students, their level of need, the way a budget is allocated is determined at the school-based level. They have certain rules. You have to have a certain number of teachers and certain numbers of classrooms based on your number of children. But whether you then invest your flexible resources in an additional counselor, in a science specialist, in an arts specialist, in an after-school program, those decisions are made at a school-based level. So we can direct, but we also need to influence, and that's an important distinction. However, one of the really important ways that equity is embedded, I'll point to two in our budgeting process. The first is the way we allocate money to schools is based on something called weighted student funding. This began in the district in about 2013. Previously, buildings were given money. And if the needs of your building changed, you might still have a lot of money that came to your school building's budget, even though children with much higher need were in another school. So in 2013 and 2014, under Superintendent Carol Johnson and the leadership of then CFO John McDonough, Boston became one of the first of about a half dozen districts nationally that began implementing weighted student funding, which it's exactly what it sounds like. Money follows children. Money doesn't go to buildings. Money is allocated based on the number of students in a building and the needs base, educational needs base of those students. So a student with disabilities brings more money because of the required services. An English learner brings more money because of their required services. And a student in a general education setting brings a lower level of funding into the school. That is the basis of how we now fund and budget our schools. So if you are a school of 500 children that also has an autism strand for some of our students with autism, has an English learner program, an SEI program for our English learners, you are going to get more money in your budget. And if you are not a school serving those children, then you will not have as much money in your budget for the same number of children. It is an equity-based budgeting tool, and so it's an important vehicle. The challenge with it is that it makes all of our schools very vulnerable to shifts in enrollment. So what that means is that if you lose 10 children, you lose that money from your budget from year to year. So what we found is that our schools are suffering from swings over shifting enrollment. So this year, and this falls under the stability goal, we have increased the amount of funding for what we call soft landings. So what that means is that last year the district buffered schools from budget swings for the first 1% of their budget. This year we increased that to buffering schools for the first 2% of their enrollment shifts. It doesn't sound like very much, but it actually can be a significant amount of money in the tens and sometimes hundreds of thousands of dollars, depending on the size of the school. That way, we don't want to step away from weighted student funding, but we also want to guard against unintended consequences of small schools that become very vulnerable to enrollment shifts. But we are preserving the focus on weighted student funding because it ensures that the money follows students. In addition, we added in this past year, and we're continuing in the current year budget, something called the Opportunity Index. So while weighted student funding looks at the educational needs of students, the Opportunity Index is again, a very forward-leaning, equity-based budgeting tool developed by our Office of Opportunity Gaps and our Equity Office. And what it does is pull in another set of conditions that focuses on concentration of student need. So weighted student funding is based on what happens inside the school building. In addition to whether or not they are students with disabilities or English learners, weighted student funding carries additional funding weights for homeless students in a school. Boston has 4,500 homeless children in our schools. We are sure that that's an undercount. It is very difficult to accurately count homeless children and families. We know if we're busing them to hotels, yes, we know they're homeless, but the couch surfing families, the couch surfing children are much harder to identify, so I would say 4,500 is a low estimate. So there is now a weight for the concentration of homeless children in our funding formula. If there's a concentration of high-need students, there's another bump if you have more than 60% high-need student. So this is a way of making equity-based budget decisions. The Opportunity Index is an interesting device because it looks at neighborhood poverty indicators and need indicators. So in Boston, because of our choice-based system, our children do not necessarily attend schools in the neighborhoods where they live. So you may have a child who's downtown at the Elliott School, but they live in Grove Hall. They carry a different needs base depending on their family composition, their income level. Some of the other measures in our Opportunity Index looks at neighborhood-based indicators of need and then factors in concentrations of those students. So now that too is built into our weighted student funding. We also use the Opportunity Index for decisions. I talked earlier about the My Way Cafe rollout, which is in 30 schools, and we're adding another 20. The way we determined which neighborhoods went first is that we used our data on the Opportunity Index to look at the neighborhood average of the weighting against the Opportunity Index and then select those neighborhoods first. So we rolled out My Way Cafe initially in East Boston, Roxbury, and Mattapan. The next two communities that are coming are Dorchester and South Boston. So it is a way that we use rules-based equity tools to set the landscape of resource allocation. And I think that it has made our budget process much more transparent. On the topic of transparency, for those of you who are budget geeks and data geeks, I'll encourage you to go to our website and go to the budget page where we just unveiled 2 weeks ago a new budget website that allows you to call up individual schools, see how their budget is allocated, compare them to other schools, look at the enrollment basis, and learn about how we do our budgeting. But I think both of those are incredibly important. The last, let me see where we are in our slides. You know what, I'm gonna come back to slides 12, 13, and 14, and 15. Oh, you know what, let me just, can we go to slide 16? One more. We'll see, one more. Okay. And I apologize for the formatting. That appears a little challenging, but this gives you a sense of the opportunity index that factors student need based on neighborhood characteristics, individual characteristics, and past performance. So this, inside the opportunity index is embedded things like a student's history of chronic absenteeism and course failures, as well as socioeconomic status and academic attainment of the neighborhood from which they come. So these are, and we've been refining this and adding in additional weights and measures. Before I go to state funding, I'm going to talk just a little bit about Build BPS. I do not have slides on this, but Build BPS is the 10-year facilities master plan for the Boston Public Schools. It was announced in 2016 by Mayor Walsh. Some of the initial steps through Build BPS focused on gathering real-time data on the status of facilities, better understanding of enrollment demographics and feeder patterns, and a development or initial development of plans to build new buildings and reconfigure a number of our schools. It stalled over the course of the past year. It was one of my mandates when I was asked to take on this role, which was to restart the Build BPS process. It is a $1 billion commitment, $750 million of it roughly from the city's capital budget, matched by state funding through the Mass School Building Authority. It aims to build new buildings and renovate some of our existing buildings, and then address long deferred maintenance in far too many of Boston's school buildings. And without my slides handy in other than hard copy, what I want to point to is that this is the largest school building in the past 40 years in Boston. With the resources at our disposal, we are looking at a plan that will allow us to build up to 5 new school buildings, 7 major renovations or expansions citywide, and there's a couple of major equity principles embedded in this work, which I want to highlight. Historically in Boston, the way you got a new school building was to be the loudest school in the room. And I'm just going to say that right out there. These were not intentional decisions. They were not driven by data. They were driven by advocacy. And so what that means is that if you were lucky, you got in the queue for the small handful of buildings that were being built. Now, some of these are wonderful schools. They're terrific schools. We're very glad they're going to have new buildings. I'm thrilled that the Boston Arts Academy will have a new building. It's currently under construction. The Josiah Quincy Upper School in Chinatown, cross your fingers if we finally find a property, will have a new school building. And the Carter School, which is one of our highly specialized schools serving some of our most medically fragile students, will also have a facility that is larger and allows us to serve more students. Those are all very good, but all of those decisions were not based in data around where we had need for increased seats for access to quality across our cities. So the Build BPS plan that we brought forth in October, which is a public and transparent plan for ongoing dialogue with individual school communities and clusters of schools as well as citywide, takes a very different approach to how we plan to site and place particularly new buildings. We are siting and placing them based on enrollment data and projection data around where we have more children than seats. It's a very simple and straightforward analysis. And right now what the data shows is that if you draw a line from the gas tank on 93, I think it's exit 11, draw an imaginary line across the city to the bottom part of the Arboretum over on the Jamaica Plains side. Pretty much everything south of that line, we have more children than seats. We struggle in a home-based assignment system to allow children and families to access the full range of choice and higher quality educational options in the southern half of the city. Whereas above that line, it's in a little better balance, although there's a lot of competition for those seats because families and students from the southern half of the city are choosing or trying to get into schools up there as well. So what we have done is identify the neighborhoods that carry the largest number of our students and place or plan to place new school buildings in that location. And for us, those neighborhoods are Dorchester, Roxbury, Mattapan, and East Boston. That is where the majority of Boston students live. Majority of BPS students currently live. So what that means is that we're going to place buildings where they need. That's where we need them. That's the first equity move. The second equity move is that we are putting the needs of our most vulnerable learners at the forefront of our planning process for these new schools. And by this I mean in particular our students with disabilities who are in highly specialized special education strands. These may be anything from our students with autism to our medically fragile students to students who are in our emotional impairment initiatives and students with significant behavioral issues that are best served in in highly specialized strands. So that means the less attractive term is sub-separate for those of you who are familiar with the education landscape. But what that means is that they are much smaller classrooms. They are much more complicated programs. On average, they take 3 classrooms for the same number of children as 1 classroom might take in a general education setting. The same is true for a number of our English learner programs. When we need additional programs in either of those domains, historically, they've been placed wherever we have space for them. What that means is that they are placed in underchosen, under-enrolled, generally low-performing schools, and so we build up an extraordinary concentration of need. Another incredibly inequitable aspect of the way our high schools are organized, it is one that we are going after directly through Build BPS, is that as a result of having this semi-autonomous school environment, we actually have, it's not just our exam schools that are selective entrance. Across the rest of our 30 high schools, we have selective entrance high schools and open enrollment high schools. A selective entrance high school would be anything from the Boston Arts Academy, where you have to audition to get in, to a Boston Community Leadership Academy and another course to college, a Fenway, where you have to do things like an interview, an essay, other evidence of suitability and interest in the school, which immediately puts barriers in front of some of our most vulnerable students. And also, many of these schools tend to be quite small, and so historically their answer whenever asked to take some of these more complicated high needs programs is, of course, we don't have space. Well, we can make space by limiting your general education enrollment and having you take a more complicated program, but that hasn't been the way Boston has operated for quite some time. So with these new buildings, what we are doing is putting the placement of these highly specialized programs as a requirement in some of the new buildings. And then schools that may have different profiles can raise their hand and say, we're going to take that on. Our school community will work to learn how to run these programs, and in exchange for coming in to get this building, we will agree to serve a larger and more diverse range of student programs. And so we are using buildings as an incentive to break out of some of the enrollment patterns that have created enormous inequities for our system. Right now, across our 30 high schools, 56% of our highest need special education students are educated in five of our open enrollment high schools. These would be your English highs, your Charlestowns, your Excels, your Brighton highs. Many of them are already level 4 turnaround schools. Many of them have been struggling academically for quite some time, and the highest concentration of our most vulnerable learners are placed in programs in these schools. Of those 5 schools, 3 of them also serve our highest concentration of English learners. So we are taking our most struggling schools, putting an extraordinarily high concentration of our highest need students in them, and then we wonder why we don't get good outcomes for the students or for the schools. So that's the pattern we're attempting to break through the framework of Build BPS. Yes, it's about buildings, but it is about equitable programming, and it's about understanding the pathways and transition points that our families go through, how enrollment, family choice, and feeder patterns and school buildings interact. So that's what's happening in Build BPS, and those are 2 of the equity principles that we have embedded in this very complicated planning process that has the ability to transform the landscape of the Boston Public Schools. So I think I'm going to stop there, take a breath. Hopefully I haven't overwhelmed quite so much. I apologize for the wonky slide deck, but I am delighted to engage in conversation and answer questions, and I'm sure we'll get to some very interesting topics that way.
I'm sure we will. How often do you get to do this full presentation?
This is actually a mashup of, let's see, I have nearly every week right now I do a budget presentation. I did one this morning for the Municipal Research Bureau. And for Build BPS, we are in constant dialogue. We have had an aggressive community engagement strategy. I'm out at community meetings, at school-based meetings, probably 2 to 3 nights a week. We have a full team that goes out to neighborhoods and school communities to talk through how we are approaching Build BPS and the facilities changes. Today in the middle of the day, we had about 20 principals who are very eager to add a 6th grade. I didn't give you the whole Build BPS presentation, but we are also looking at reducing transitions for families and building school environments that are more sustainable in terms of size, enrollment size, and thus budget. Boston right now has a landscape of about 26 different grade configurations. You can go to a school that is K0, which is for 3-year-olds, to 2nd grade. We have some that are K0 to 1st grade. We have some that are 3 to 8. We have K to 5s. We have K to 5s. We have K to 8s. We have 6 to 8s. We have 9 to 12s. We have 7 to 12s. We have 6 to 12s. It is insanity. It is also very difficult for families. So I mentioned I was a longtime BPS parent. My children went through 4 schools between kindergarten and high school graduation. They went through 3 of them in a 5-year period. Oh my God. Exactly. God was not involved in the design of this system. Let's just put that out there. But in any case, then again, Boston is not a uniform landscape, and our buildings are not uniform. We have small jewel box schools. We have larger elementary schools. So in any change initiative, you also have to look at feasibility and what you have to work with. And so what we are aiming, the other reality in Boston is that our 6 to 8 middle schools are the least chosen, and wherever there is any opportunity for families to make other choices, they do. As a result, in 2009, we had 16 standalone middle schools. These are serving grades 6 to 8 only. Today we have 6. Those 6 lost 1,800 students in enrollment in the past 6 years alone. So by saying that we are phasing out middle schools, which is also a principle in Build BPS, that's not a philosophical decision. We can have a philosophical debate about the best way to educate middle graders, and we should, but in terms of standalone middle schools, it's not a philosophical decision. It's a recognition of what has already happened in Boston, the unintended consequences of past decisions. So Boston dramatically expanded its K to 8s without paying attention to what it would do to enrollment in our standalone middle schools. At the exact same time, in the same 10 to 15 year period, that there was an explosion of charter school growth. Charter schools tend to open in 5th, 6th, and 7th grade. So our middle schools were caught in a vortex of competition. They ended up the losers. It was the fastest collapse from an enrollment perspective of a group of schools that I have seen. And so of the last remaining 6 that are now occupying campuses that are much larger than what they need, that represents one of the major opportunities to rebuild schools that are sustainable and that meet the broader range of student need. So what we are looking at is aiming to a more simplified landscape for schools. We do have a number of strong K-8s. Families do love them. We have a number of 9 to 12s that are strong and are not going to be able in their current buildings to go 7 to 12. So we're going to preserve those while a lot of the newer buildings will be K-6 and 7 to 12. So that means that families ideally have the option of one choice, one transition along their K-12 pathway, which is much more rational for families. It's also more rational for programming, for enrollment patterns, for all the things that a system needs to do in order to get their children to learning environments every day.
Say a little about how you have been managing pushback on the building program and the reallocation of those capital resources, and then we'll open up for questions.
Let's see, I think one of one of the things that we have tried to do is put forward a plan that is genuinely for comment and input and with the ability to make changes, but not to deviate from core principles. And that is, it's a challenging line to walk. But let me give you an example. So we are not going to change the principles of placing school buildings where there is high student need and low historic access. We're not going to step away from the principle of equity of program placement for our most vulnerable learners. However, when we look at individual school transitions, the first middle school to transition is the McCormick Middle School on Columbia Point in Dorchester. We announced that. We can talk about school closures in a moment, but this is really a transition, transformation, and evolution of a school. We announced that transparently that all middle schools will be converting over the course of the coming 10 years. Actually, I think I've got about 8 years to go. Not me personally, but the district has 8 years to go. In any case, in order to transition a middle school into a 7 to 12 or a K to 6, you have to find places for the 7th and 8th graders and for the 6th graders. So the initial framework that we laid out was that we would have the 7th and 8th graders go to Excel in South Boston while the McCormick space was renovated, and we did not talk about who would go into the renovated 7 to 12 campus. We got a lot of pushback from the McCormick community. They were concerned about going to Excel, which is a troubled school, and they themselves, unbeknownst to us, a number of teachers had been working very hard on design concepts for creating a 7 to 12. We listened to that, we paid attention to it, and we tried to find modifications where we could. Today, the McCormick teachers are now part of a planning team with central office staff. We are selecting with them a high school partner who will then be part of the three-legged planning team, central office as the facilitator and moderator, a strong middle school team, and a high school team who will together then work with us over the course of another 1.5 years while the building is being renovated to design a 7 to 12 school, again with those same equity principles. And then they, the McCormick, which is being displaced, will then be the community that goes back into the newly renovated 7 to 12. Those are the kinds of changes that can be made. Now, interestingly, if you picked up the Globe, once this started coming out, what you'll hear is, you know, superintendent backs off of plan. No, the plan was always to have a conversation and then in an iterative process, make the changes where we can that are intelligent, that are responsive to feedback, that leverage the expertise of our educators, but that hold true to the same principles. The McCormick is still closing as a standalone middle school. We're still going to have a 7 to 12 that has a broad array of programs, but the community can be part of that planning and solution. So those are some of the ways that we try to modify.
That explains why I stopped getting calls from the McCormick teachers.
That would be exactly why. One of the things that I heard, so when I first arrived as interim superintendent, one of the first things I did, I knew coming in that there was an increasingly fractured relationship between central office and school communities. I had watched it, we had all seen it, it had played out in the newspapers. In my prior role, I heard about it on a regular basis from school leaders and educators with whom we worked. So I knew there needed to be a reset, and in my mind, a reset around the role of central office that often gets caught up in compliance. Compliance is a function of any system, particularly when it comes to paying attention to balancing equity concerns across citywide needs. Individual schools aspire for what they want. It is the district's job in a positive way to be the countervailing force to ensure that all students' needs are met. But at the same time, the functional role of central office, in my mind, is to serve as a tactical support unit for school improvement in individual communities. It is the frontline educators, our staff, our paraprofessionals, our teachers, our school leaders, our bus drivers, our custodians, and our monitors, but particularly the staff in buildings. They are the ones who touch the lives of our students every day. If central office is not delivering relevant support to them, then we are not equipping our schools to be the strongest that they can. So the first thing that I did was host 11 closed-door listening sessions with school leaders. I got to 74 of them in the first 5 weeks. These were just myself, 6 to 12 school leaders, and a note taker external to the district, so that they had an opportunity to have an unvarnished conversation with me about what they felt needed to change inside the district. One of the things I heard, particularly about Build BPS, was put a plan out there that we can respond to. Make it a public conversation. Because Build BPS is complicated, because it's talking about shifting schools, and yes, closing schools, it was a closely guarded secret. Not even everyone inside of BPS fully understood what was being discussed. You cannot change a public system that way. So the first thing that I focused on doing was working with it, first of all, infusing more folks into the team, and then working with the team to put the plan together so that we could put it in front of folks to make it a public conversation. You cannot talk about school change if you are not prepared to warn people, educate them, and then sit down with them as we grapple with the implications for school communities.
Questions? Up in the back, yes.
Hi, my name is Ivy. I'm actually a Boston Public School graduate, so it's kind of ironic being here because I also graduated from Northeastern, which is where I found out, like, oh, I was actually tracked to go to a four-year institution. So advanced work class, BLA, right on that path. So the irony of sitting here and listening to this here and thinking about the 5 BPS schools that I attended, 3 of them are no longer in existence.
Yes.
For various reasons as well. Some of them decade of the one. But my question is about the pipeline programs that you have, which I know from being a teacher, you know, para to, and I imagine high school teacher are more longer term investments.
Yes, that's 7 years. It's going to take us a while to see those teachers in our classroom.
Great, and I believe that that's necessary. I run an organization where we provide summer teaching fellowships to college students as well to promote this longer term investment in the pipeline.
Is that Breakthrough?
Generation Teach.
Oh, wonderful.
Specifically teachers of color.
Thank you.
And so we have about 75% of our students are students of color who are interested in teaching. And it's that next step into, well, how do I get into BPS system to actually make it? So my question for you is, how many years are you wanting to invest in these pipeline programs? And what would be the measure of success? Like, is there, we have to produce X number of teachers? And what does the funding look like to truly support not just the program in existence, the staff, but like the barriers that will ultimately come, like
So I really wish that Saren Daly was here with me right now. So she is our Director of Recruitment and Diversity and has developed and manages a number of these pipeline programs. So I will not be able to get to the level of detail that she could, but I want to make sure you know her name because she is someone who, if you haven't already, it's definitely worth connecting with her. But these are long-term commitments from the district. You just pointed to the high school teaching program. That's a 7-year pathway. It takes a very long time for that to bear any fruit, if you will, for BPS. Whereas the MTEL, MTEL support, I can tell you, I just put that money into the budget for this coming year. We had sort of scrabbled together a little bit of money for the first half FTE pilot, and immediately have invested more because the data is showing that we're recovering teachers. And so I think we are playing a long game here. I have not heard that we have particular benchmarks for how many teachers a program needs to produce. What I do know is that when a program does not appear to be gathering enough attention, then we assess and reimagine it. So actually the high school to teacher program is one that recently went through a redesign in order to strengthen the potential that it would actually attract students who could stay in it over time. UMass Boston has been a frequent partner of ours in terms of the degree granting components of these programs. So a number of these are degree granting programs as well. It's another way that we're not so much circumventing the traditional teacher prep program. Actually, we'd be delighted to be flooded by candidates through those programs as well, but to open up parallel pathways.
Yes, good evening. So I'm in the graduate class, but I also former full-time BPS teacher. I taught 4th grade at Winthrop and 4th grade at Murphy.
Wonderful, thank you.
Drastically different elementary schools.
Yes. The Winthrop just exited its turnaround status, and which was a huge celebration for them.
Congratulations on that. I think, and also I teach currently in the EFA program that you mentioned,
Great.
coding and robotics up the street at Orchard Gardens.
Oh, wonderful.
My question is around institutional bias as it relates to teachers of color, and more specifically, male teachers of color. Nationally, it's like 2% of the teacher workforce, but yet we hear lots of words under the importance around having teachers who are reflective of the students and all the benefits that that may. But then the reality that I left the classroom full time was because of the culture in which I was treated.
Yep.
Minimalizing, like being a teacher and focused on behavior or things that my gender and race benefits in, but not what my job is. And so I guess my question is, having more teachers of color who look like the students is great in theory, but then the environment and the culture in which they're the reasons why the numbers are so low in the first place.
Yep.
What are you doing to address the reason why we have to have this program in the first place? Because that's my reality.
Yep.
I don't teach full time because it's more stressful to be around the adults than it is to be around the children that I feel like is my purpose. So.
I feel a little bit of your pain. Let me just put it that way. And thank you for that. So what you're talking about goes to really how we retain and how we create leadership pathways for our educators, particularly our educators of color, and our male educators, period. Because they are, anytime I walk into a classroom where there is a male educator, I can see boys engaging in a different way. If anyone needs evidence, we can provide all kinds of research-backed evidence, but it makes a huge difference. It's incredibly important. And so I'd say we have a long way to go on this front, but over the course of at least the past 2 years, and so I've gotten a close view at them this year, BPS has been developing a number of affinity groups that are important conversation places. So we have male educators of color, we have female educators of color, we have race and culture-based groupings of teachers. These are facilitated by BPS staff from the Equity Office or from the Opportunity Gaps Office that are deliberately getting at this notion of culture, community, leadership, can be very hard to accomplish when you are one of one in a school building. And so I think we have to continue to look at ways to create those pathways across school buildings, because it is very difficult to build up a community of significant size in any one school, unless you're talking about our largest schools or our high schools. So that is one change and shift that I have seen in BPS in just the past couple of years. And I think it is also in keeping with this broader focus on leadership development, both teacher leadership and leadership pipelines to school leadership in the district. But I would say that we are scratching the surface. But I'm glad you're not too far from the education space, or not far at all. So at any point that you're willing to consider poking the bear once again. Okay, no. All right. Well, it was worth trying, but.
I'm an entrepreneur now.
All right, excellent. Fair enough. And glad you're still associated with the school environment. But no, you raise a very important point. And so thank you for that.
I have two questions, but I'll try to keep it down. My first question is in regards to the valedictorian situation. So the Boston Globe tracked down 93 of them.
Yep.
And 80% of them are the first to graduate in their family. But then again, they didn't finish college within 6 years,
Right.
and the pay rate is less than 50 grand.
Yep.
But then you're also implementing, you're having action the Excellence for All program, rigorous, curriculum. Does that benefit towards, changing that situation? Or do you think maybe you need more programs, more pathway programs that probably include volunteers, mentors, I should say?
Yep.
To help develop, motivate them, especially coming from broken families, situations at home not being dealt properly, and they don't feel the need to stay in class and listen, and they're not motivated. I don't want to be in class at this time.
Yep.
Yeah, how do you plan on fixing that issue? And number two, the Cook twin situation from Mystic Valley Charter School. The
Oh,
twins
goodness.
were suspended.
The hair braiding?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Do
Okay.
you think the policies and procedures are dealt with fairly, or do you think they're implemented, like the way they're implemented affects certain race? Because they're wearing, it says, I think it says braid or hair extensions, sorry, that are longer than
Yeah.
2 inch.
Okay.
Can,
Yeah.
With an extension
Yep.
color, pink, blue. Is it only braids alone?
No, I have.
And does that affect the students of color's learning?
I'm sure it does. It's incredibly inappropriate and outright wrong. I will point out Mystic Valley Charter School is not a Boston public school. It's not in Boston. That would not be, that would absolutely not be allowed to happen. There's a lot that BPS doesn't get right, but I can tell you that would be a complete non-starter. And I think really, quite frankly, educators of nearly every environment, charter, district, traditional, I know no educators who thought that was okay. And it's.
But do you think the rules and the policies in the school system in general are tailored to affect?
No, we actually have a long way to go, although I will say that Boston has started making some progress over the past couple of years. So I want to leave Mystic Valley apart, because that was just plain wrong. And quite frankly, the state came in and told them that as well, for what it's worth. But it should never have happened in the first place. But in terms of discipline and code of conduct, these are very complicated issues in our schools. We have real incidents of discipline and public safety, and we need to ensure that all of our students are safe. And so bad things can happen in our school buildings, because bad things can happen in our neighborhoods and in our communities. And so we can't pretend that that isn't a reality, but at the same time, code of conduct and discipline violations that suspends kids that absolutely are not equitable in terms of who and how they land, that has to change. It is now outside of BPS's code of conduct, which has undergone some recent revisions, but I think the most promising dimension is a pro-social approach, which is restorative justice, which is now becoming a much more widely adopted and increasingly promoted approach to discipline and behavior management in our school buildings, which takes a much more asset-based approach, which is focused on reconciliation, that is based in social emotional learning, but still is an effort to help students understand how to be accountable for their actions and the impact that their behaviors may have on others. And so I think that that is one of the most promising and important strategies, and it is increasingly embedded in how we approach schools. You had a very large valedictorian and high school question, but I see other hands up. But I'm happy to go to the valedictorian question as well.
Do
I'll
the
let you be mine.
valedictorian.
Okay. So the valedictorian project, always an interesting exercise. Of course, they were looking at students through 2005 to 2007. But nonetheless, I think probably I can tell you right now that we know we have academic rigor issues in a number of our schools. We, of course, are looking to, the focus on closing opportunity gaps as well as achievement gaps is also about equipping students with the toolkit and experience that makes them more resilient, that gives them opportunities to thrive and succeed through post-secondary pathways, whatever they may be. One of the things I do want to say, because when I read through that series, I was just fascinated. I'm going to come back to what work needs to happen in our high schools, but I was fascinated by the fact that they never clearly articulated what the Globe defined as success. So one of their featured students, Michael Bailey, I think was his name, he was the first story in the series. He's in the armed forces, he's a caring and attentive father of 2, he has a stable and committed home environment for his children, but he said he wanted to become a doctor, and when he was 17, and he went down a different path. Is that a failure? Is he a failure? I just found that very interesting that they had a very limited definition. If I was being judged on whether or not success was what I thought I was going to be when I was 17 years old, then I'd be a veterinarian. And I'm pretty sure my skill set would have been misapplied to the animals in this world. So I can't help pointing to that as an aside, and I've actually heard that from a number of folks, and I think that's important. That said, there is no question that we have extraordinary work to do, particularly in our high schools. One of the challenges of inheriting a system during an abrupt leadership transition and a system somewhat in disarray is that it's hard to sequence the things that you need to get to simultaneously. So the first month was really getting a hold of central office and rebuilding the leadership team. The 3 months were, as somebody said today, restarting the Build BPS process. That immediately rolled into our budgeting process, but which is now fully underway. The budget is out for public discussion and debate. And so this month and next month, my goal is to launch a series of high school working groups that will start initially with school leaders and central office staff. They will eventually branch out, of course, to our educators, but also to partners and experts. But I really need it to start with operational practitioners at the ground level. Boston is lousy with reports, with recommendations, with studies. What it lacks is synthesis and implementation. So my charge to these groups in a couple of key areas is here's the stack of reports and recommendations. Here's the things that we know need to happen in our schools. Now, how are we going to sequence them? Which do we go after first? What's the feasibility? Let's put them in order so we do some of the early things and easier things quickly and sequence some of the harder and more complicated changes. Let me make that very specific. So one of the things that is highlighted, not that I needed it highlighted because it's extraordinarily obvious, Boston has 33 high schools, and we have 33 graduation requirements, and very few of them align with the voluntary Mass Core standards. That's going to be a work group. And the reason it's going to be a work group is that we have a district with 30% mobility. So what this means is that if a kid's in high school and it's not working for them, they try and go to another high school, they've got different graduation requirements, and that child can't graduate. And they don't understand that or know that until they get to that other school. We can fix that. That is a fixable problem. And so that is one. Another is going to be, and so that's going to be the advancing academic rigor that looks at graduation requirements, dual enrollment opportunities, international baccalaureate, and AP. Another one will be focusing on early warning indicators and off-track youth, as well as our alternative education programs and models. A third will be focusing on career pathways and career and technical education. So that is some of the work that needs to happen in our high schools.
I saw two hands over here, and then we'll go up to the back. Yeah.
So I wanted to get your personal take on teacher residency. And I don't know if there's any data on it, but do you see that if there's a disconnect when disciplining students, because not only are these teachers not reflective of the many different races in the BPS system, but they're not from the city. So there may be, or there probably is, a cultural disconnect from being raised in the city as opposed to being from the suburbs.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see, is there a disconnect when disciplining children in the BPS, whether it's middle school or high school at the elementary level, whereas opposed to a teacher from the city may not even give a second look at a disciplinary issue as opposed to a teacher outside the city? Is there any data on that, or how do you feel about teacher residency? Would you require that?
Thank you. So you're talking about teachers having to live in the city of Boston. Yeah, okay. We also have something called Boston Teacher Residency. So for a moment I was, which is a program, a teacher training program built on a medical residency model. But to the topic of teacher residency, you know, personally I'm a lifelong, well, I can't say lifelong. I am a 30-plus year Boston resident. I believe that living in the community where you work matters. So from a personal perspective, I think it's incredibly important. I would say it's, but at the same time, we need teachers from wherever we can find them, and then we need to grow and support and nurture their cultural development inside our school system. So I would be very hesitant to further narrow the pool of educators that we can draw into our school buildings. And then I'm also a political realist. And so teachers were, by contract, excluded from any residency requirements. So there's a city employee residency requirement that does not include Boston's police officers or Boston's teachers. I'm prepared to take on a lot of hard battles, but that's probably not the battle I'm going to fight in the near term, because, and really it's about this question that we cannot afford to narrow the funnel for teachers. So we really need to look at what is our induction program once they get to us. What is the student teaching pathway that gives them greater exposure? But you're absolutely right that the cultural distinctions between our students and our adults are something that we have to very deliberately work at, because it does impact expectations, it impacts treatment, and it particularly shows in things like code of conduct and discipline.
Yeah, and we have to ask, can teachers afford to live in Boston these days?
Well, that's another.
And do we
Yeah.
really believe that a teacher from Chelsea, who's living in Chelsea, doesn't understand students in JP? You know, we're a pretty small community here, so that's also an issue. Anyway,
Yes.
Yes.
I had a question. Kind of going back to what Jenkins was saying about disparate impact based on policy. So the current school busing, this current home-based school choice busing system allows students to go to schools closer to their homes. However, we know that this policy is causing increased amounts of racial segregation. And we also know that students who are Black or Latino are traveling further to their schools, even under the home-based system, than white and Asian students.
Yes.
So my question is,
Less than they were before,
less
I
than
will
they
point
were,
out.
But
Yeah.
then we also still have increased racial segregation. So my question to you is, how do we balance the idea of students having to travel farther to their homes and racial integration, as well as the question of, under this new policy, we still see that disadvantaged communities have to travel farther than more affluent communities. So
Yep.
how are you going
Yep.
to address that?
Yep. So, in full disclosure, in my prior role as CEO of Edvestors, I was actually on the committee that worked on the home-based assignment system 3 years ago. That was a year and a half of my life, committee and community meetings. And yes, the home-based assignment system, unlike the old citywide zone-based choice system, begins to factor in equity of access, but it is hampered by the limited supply of quality. So the first answer is build BPS, and the new facilities that we are attempting to build are deliberately aimed at siting those new buildings, and then some of the major renovations and the creation and the placement of different schools in the neighborhoods that have the least amount of access. So we're literally trying to increase the number of desirable seats closer to the homes of the students who are least served. That's not gonna be a quick fix, but in large public bureaucracies, that's sort of I would say that within 3 to 7 years, we will begin to see some impact on that. That is probably the biggest focus, is expanding quality and access within the home-based assignment system. And as more of those seats come online, then it broadens the choice baskets for the students whose choice baskets currently go out the farthest in order to get them sufficient access to quality schools. That's one. In terms of the concentration and segregation of our schools, I want to caution you to base that in data and base that in comparative data. So we have a school system where 87% of our students are students of color and 13% are white. And so even when the Globe did its big resegregation story earlier this fall, they were talking about a growth from, if I recall the numbers right, and I don't have that file handy in front of me right now, 3 schools with more than 50% white students growing to 5 schools with more than 50% white schools over a 20-year period. Yes, that's an increase in concentration of students, but in a system that's 87% students of color, if you are only looking at this as students of color versus white, it's going to be we're going to have a very hard time figuring out how we diversify our schools with such a small percentage of students currently citywide that are in the Boston Public Schools. And further accelerated by the challenges of gentrification and housing prices and costs. So this is a broader issue that we're going to be struggling with some time, and I do not think the assignment policy is going to fix it. I don't think any assignment policy is going to alone be able to countervail housing and gentrification patterns, and it will be slow in terms of increasing the overall numbers of students in our school system. So I think the most direct, although it is not rapid either, path to increasing equity is changing the landscape and accessibility of quality school options within the home-based assignment system.
Okay, we have time for 2 more, up in the back and right here.
I've
re-emphasizing and keep re-emphasizing as they, excel to pass on to each grade. And if it's not re-emphasized into middle school, you have to re-emphasize it all the way through to high school. Why? Because when they come into these higher institutions of learning, a lot of our high school graduates are getting put back into remedial because the professors are indicating you should have learned this in high school.
It sounds as though you just answered your question.
And I don't disagree with the thing you said, Linda. One of my focus areas prior to coming into the system as interim superintendent was on upper elementary and middle grade math rigor. So we are slamming the door shut to a number of our students before they even get to the opportunity for advanced placement and rigorous math in high school, because so many of our 8th graders leave our school system not yet proficient in math. We're facing a similar imperative when it comes to science. Science is a different story. Science was squeezed out of our elementary schedules in the same way that arts was squeezed out of many elementary schedules around time on learning and around direct instruction. I'm pleased to say that I spent the last 10 years before coming into this position attacking the issue of equitable access to arts education. Boston has had one of the most accelerated expansions of systemic arts instruction over the past 10 years. 17,000 more students now receive arts instruction during the school day. That too is an opportunity gap closer. We increased the number of BPS certified arts teachers by 75% over a 10-year period. It is possible. I am now finding that we have to do that exact same thing when it comes to science instruction in grades 3 to 8, and I live in fear that the progress I made in arts is now going to be threatened by the things that we need to do to expand time on learning in science instruction. This is in the context of a school system that has a very short school day, although Boston has invested a lot of money in expanded hours of operation over the past few years. It's come at an incredibly high cost, and it added about 40 minutes to an average school day. So science instruction is one of the priority investments in this year's budget. Focused specifically on grades 3 to 8. We've actually made more progress in high school in the rigor of science instruction at the high school level. But we are back, just as the colleges are backfilling in remediation for the students that we exit without a sufficiently rigorous instructional course of study. The same thing is happening in our high schools, because right now about 20% of our elementary students are proficient in science. That absolutely has to change.
Last question or comment.
Thank you. I'm interested in learning about how you think this concept of sending kids out to the suburbs and back. And there's been, all over the country, there's been, I've experienced at least 6 of them, different ways of bringing kids in, white kids in and black kids out, and mixing them that way. We have Metco here. How do you feel that program is? Is it antiquated? Is it a good one? Is it another way of mixing the pot?
Apparently I'm going to be looking a little more closely at Metco because the state is proposing some changes to the model, so I'm going to be very interested to take a look at that. What I would say right now is that on the one hand, Metco, I think, has been a challenge for Boston because it has drawn off some of the families who are highly engaged in their educational process, who would be important advocates and players in the landscape of our public schools, but they are elsewhere because our interests as parent advocates follow where our children are. On the flip side, Boston has not provided sufficient, accessible and equitable pathways to rich learning opportunities for our students. And so until we do, I cannot talk about anything that would remove those pathways of opportunity for families who wouldn't otherwise have them. So we are stuck in a conundrum of our own making, and until we strengthen the educational opportunities for students in our system, we cannot, it is not fair to cut off families' opportunities for choice when we're not meeting their needs in our school system today.
How many schools do that? Do you know how big the program is?
I don't have those figures off the top of my head. I might guess that it's somewhere around 3,000 students, but don't quote me on that.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Is that a good ballpark? Yeah.
So, tonight's been an extraordinary learning experience, I think, for all of us. Let's thank Laura for her presentation, and thank you all for being here.